The Converted Man here. So I'm taking a look at this YouTuber called Red Pen Logic. Theistic apologist type, I think. And he started sometime last year, looks like April 24th last year, and somehow has 19.7K subscribers. That's pretty impressive. So good job doing that. Not sure how, but you did that. That's the thing you did. So and then in this particular video, he goes over the this particular tweet from whatever the atheist forum is. Forum Atheist made this tweet and is saying that atheist disproves God by assuming materialism, and obviously he's saying atheism disproves immaterial God by assuming materialism, right? Well, there would be a contradiction in terms. If it is an immaterial thing, then asking anything that about material properties would be a category error. But in order to establish that it is a category in the first place would fully be on the burden of the theist. Theists sometimes say that God is immaterial, or God is outside of the universe, or other things like that. Well, what does that mean? It's not like anything that we have in this universe that we can observe and test and poke and pry at. So what does that mean to be? So it's very difficult to ask things about God. So what is God? Let's start with that question. Not who is God, because that assumes a who. What do you mean by the word God? And I'm not asking for attributes. I'm asking for you to define this thing in some way, shape, or form. How could you do that if it isn't anywhere anything like what we have? The best you could do would be to offer analogies and say it's kind of like this, or it's kind of like that, or something like that. But ultimately, the question would be, how do you know any of that is true at all, unless you're assuming that there is an immaterial in the first place that anything can be at all? So isn't that also a problem? Now, I'll give this tweet. If God is immaterial, what is he made of? Is in I don't know who made this tweet or whatever. I don't know if this cherry picked. I don't know anything. But that is a malformed question, because it assumes too many things. It assumes that that God is a he, first of all, and also it's a contradiction. If it's immaterial, then it's not made out of material. But you could ask, if it's immaterial, like, how does that work? Like, what is immaterial? What is that? What does that look like? How does that work? What realm, or in what way? Because you're saying that there's a thing called God, or whatever you want to call it, spirit, soul, spirit, whatever it is, that's non-material. And it's like, is it energy? Well, energy is energy material? And then no, it's not energy. Okay, then what is it? Because you can tell me what it's not all day long, great, but that doesn't tell me what it actually is. So yeah, the first question's flawed, malformed. If he isn't made of material, then does he exist? Well, again, you're assuming a he, and you shouldn't do that. If God is non-material, how how could it exist would be a better way to phrase that question. Or forget about the God part. How could anything non-material exist? In what way would it exist? Or rather than saying exist, because that might not be precise enough, we could say, how could it be that something like this is not just an object of the mind? That it is more than just our own ideas that we've come up with, that it's something actually really real, as opposed to objects of the mind that exist, but they exist only in our mind, only in our brains, that we, like letters, numbers, words, musical notes. Those are concepts that we can convey to each other. We can write them down, we can draw them, and we can explain them and utilize them for all sorts of purposes. But at the end of the day, there is no number two out there in some metaphysical sense. It exists as long as there's humans to actualize it by the processes of thinking. And this is ignoring the possibility of alien intelligence in the universe and all that. But nonetheless, if there was no one to think about those sort of concepts, then they wouldn't be, because the only way that they exist is in the mind. So we have to draw a distinction between existing in a meaningful way outside of the mind, independently of our own thoughts, feelings, desires, etc., and existing in the mind, and as something that is a transferable idea, like a concept that you can convey, like the triangle. That's a universal. Triangle doesn't exist. Only particular types of triangles exist. So a right angle triangle, actually you could draw that, but you can't draw triangle because it's just a concept. So you could write out triangle, but that's not triangle. It's the essence of triangle, and this is just a concept. So it's something that exists in the head of humans, and that's it. So that's useful, perhaps, but it's not. When we say real or exist, what is it we're trying to say? We're saying as real as I am. I am this being of matter, and I have energy, and all of these work according to certain physics, and we could go the biological route, we could go the molecular route, the chemical route, whatever, and the sum total of what I am is particular particles of energy swirling around in a certain pattern that's maintained through whatever forces hold molecules together, and okay, so at that level, you get to some point where there hits a question mark where you're like, I don't know what's smaller than a quark, right? So you would run out of a way to answer what a human is at some level, but you could still answer all the things of what I am, or what humans are, because we can be observed, we can be tested, the component parts of us can be understood. Whereas whatever God is, whatever you think God is, the only information about God seems to come from writings about God, writings made by other humans. Now, you can claim that those humans were inspired by God, or you can claim that the writing itself was written by God if you want, but those are just claims that then would have to be shown to be true as well. But this idea of non-material is just this abstraction. The material universe is what we know. Okay, so God's not that. Okay, well, was that? How does that work? That's so your brain just goes, what? It doesn't compute. It's like it's nothing like we've ever seen before. Okay, great. How do you know that's even a thing then? And unless you can demonstrate some logical, some methodological way of showing that there is a realm like that, then how can you categorize anything in that realm at all? So I would say, instead of just saying, if it's if it's not material, does it exist? So what is this like at all? How does any of this work? That would have been a better question. And then, how do so many people believe he exists but can't describe what it's made out of? Laughing my ass off. Okay, so asking why or how people believe is not relevant. People believe in all sorts of things, all sorts of absurdities, as well as all sorts of true things and semi-true things and whatever, because belief is a psychological thing. So how do people believe this? Because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. Now, as far as describing what something is made of, there's plenty of things that I believe in the sense that I agree that they exist, and I don't really know what they're made out of. Or at some point, I couldn't, go into what, it's like plastic. Well, what's plastic made out of? It's like, I'd have to look it up to get technical about that. And I'm like, I don't know. It's made of plastic. I don't know. I'm stupid. Okay. That's the answer. Plastic's made of plastic. It's made up of chemicals and molecules. I don't know. I'd have to look it up, right, to answer the question. But I still think it's a thing. But I think it's a thing because I can observe that it's a thing, and we've labeled this plastic, and we can test it. It has certain properties that other materials don't. Okay. So this question is erroneous and relevant because you're asking, well, how do people believe this? Well, because people have brains and they can believe things. People are pattern-seeking creatures. It's irrelevant whether or not you can describe something to whether or not you would believe that something is. So I would just have left that last question out. Now, because this guy's going to make fun of it and say that all these have logical fallacies, I wonder what logical fallacies he's going to point out. The first one should be a malformed question. The second one, well, malformed and loaded question. And the second one would also be a malformed loaded question. The third one should be irrelevant as well as, I would say erroneous, but this is pretty much irrelevant. An appeal to other incredulity, like not personal incredulity, but other people, like how that you're making this claim implicit within the question that you can't believe in something if you don't know what it's made out of or something like that. So there's all sorts of potential fallacies that he could list off. And I haven't watched the video, so I have no idea what fallacies he's going to say. I wonder what he's going to say. So let's find out.
Belief in God is laughable because any thoughtful person following this atheist line of reasoning should see how foolishly funny it is to believe in an immaterial God. All right, it's time to pull out the red pen and take this from the top. Atheist Forum's first question sounds strange because it contains a fundamental flaw. It's an incoherent question. That means it doesn't make any sense. An immaterial being, by definition, is not made of material. I'm not going too quickly here, am I? God is not made of anything. God is spirit.
Okay, so as I said, incoherent or loaded, malformed question. So you got that partially right. Let me go back here. So incoherent question, malformed question. Either one is acceptable as a logical fallacy. Okay, what we mean by immaterial is the opposite of material. So you cannot ask. It's a category error. He should have mentioned that as well. Then he makes an assertion. God is immaterial. Okay. That is an assertion you're making that is independent of complaining about the fallacy of the question. That assertion has to be proven through some method or logical argument. He's not going to offer that, I guarantee it, but he would need to do that if he wanted to not get the red pen treatment himself. To say that something is spirit has no meaning unless you define spirit. Well, God isn't made of things, it's a spirit. That's another assertion. What now you have to say, now you have to prove that God is spirit. You have to then explain spirit. What does that mean? How does that work? How do you know that God is spirit? You can't just assert that it's spirit, or in this case, appealing to a definition of God that agrees that it's spirit would also not work, because that would be the potential appealing to definition fallacy, which I could have mentioned that he almost did there with saying that the definition of immaterial is there, but that actually was the correct application of the definition, so it wasn't that particular fallacy. But how do you know that God is spirit or that God is immaterial? You're just asserting here that this is the way it is.
Quickly here, am I? God is not made of anything. God is spirit. He has no mass, no form, no pieces that need to be put together. He's not extended in space. He's not made of God particles or spaghetti. Huh? Yeah, I'm talking to you, Pastafarians. The question, if God is immaterial, what is he made of, is like asking, if a bachelor is unmarried, who is he married to? A bachelor, by definition, is not married to anyone. So the first question seems to be based on a confusion about God, who is, by definition, immaterial and not assembled out of anything.
Well, no, not all gods are by definition immaterial. This is another assertion that you've made, and this one is simply false. Some gods are proposed to be material to some extent or in some way. So more materialistic types of gods might be like Zeus, or maybe some of the Hindu gods or something like this. But not all gods are defined in that way. Your particular god might be defined in that way, but that's not all gods. So you would get another red pen mark here from me. If I had a red pen, I have a black pen. I guess I could use that, but then I'd have to mark my screen up or something. I don't know how to. I'd have to do these sort of graphics. I don't know how to do that. Anyways, so you asserted that God is this other thing, but you haven't demonstrated that God is that other thing.
Next, Atheist Forum asks, if God isn't made of material, then does he exist? Here we go from confused reasoning to circular reasoning, out of the frying pan and into the fire. Stay with me on this. Imagine I said to you, Ryan always tells the truth. And you ask, how do you know Ryan always tells the truth? And I reply, because he said so. And if he always tells the truth, then he wouldn't be lying. See the problem here? The answer to your question presumes what needs to be proved. The only way Atheist Forum gets the answer it wants is if it suddenly starts with the answer it wants. Only
wrong way on that one. I mean, I see where you're going with it, but no. This is, yeah, you could say circular, but then you have to assume that they're assuming materialism, and you don't know that. So that would be a potential fallacy, not an actual one. I would have stuck with incoherent question again, because it's basically a rewording of the first question. But good attempt. I see where you're coming from, because you think that, you know, how is it that this non-material thing exists? The question is malformed, or as you put it, incoherent question. It doesn't assume materialism, though. Nowhere in the question is that implied. Does it exist if it's not material? Doesn't pre-assume that the only things that can exist are material. It's just like, basically, if you were to try to steel man this question and fix the question as I did, you'd say, well, what they're trying to ask is, how does something exist that isn't like the other things that we know exist for sure, right? So it's not circular, but, good try. It would be circular if it said the only things that can exist are material. God isn't material. God exists. Something like that. I guess you could say it was circular in that sense, but pretty close. I would agree with this being an actual fallacy if you could demonstrate that they're actually assuming materialism, but that would be something that you could only do if the question itself assumed that, and it doesn't necessarily assume that. It's simply saying if it isn't made out of material, or if it shouldn't be he, it should just be if it isn't, but whatever, then does it exist? And that doesn't assume material, and therefore is not circular.
Material things exist. Of course, they're going to say that God doesn't exist because their materialism already dictates that he can't exist. But that's presuming what needs to be proved. That's called circular reasoning. Incidentally, philosophers, and atheists, by the way, routinely speak of real things that are not made of material.
Okay, so before I get to that, so no, you're assuming that they're assuming materialism, so you don't know that, and thus your logical fallacy here isn't the correct one. There is a fallacy here. I'll grant that. It's just also it's an incoherent question, just like the first one was. So yeah.
Like reasoning and arguments and logical fallacies. Finally, Atheist Forum asks, how does
Okay, I'm going to have to give you a red pen on equivocation here. If by exist, you are talking about the same sort of things like reasoning, arguments, and logical fallacies, then God exists in the exact way that I think God exists. That is as a byproduct of the brain. Reasoning is a function of the brain. Arguments are a function of the brain. Logical fallacies are a function of the brain. These things cannot exist without the brain or the mind. I try to avoid the word mind because it's somewhat loaded, or implies that there's a separation of brain and mind, and there isn't, as far as I can tell. Your brain is your mind is a byproduct of your brain, however you want to put that. And to what extent, I don't know, because I'm no neurologist. I wouldn't have any idea. But reasoning is in my brain and in your brain and in others' brains. So are arguments and so are logical fallacies. But these things are not made out of anything. They do not exist other than as concepts in the mind. So if we're going to put God along with those, then God too only exists in the mind. And then I would agree that's the only place God could exist, if it is exactly the same as reasoning and or arguments and or logical fallacies. So if you want God to be a different category than those things, then you'd have to explain, demonstrate, somehow show, or argue somehow that God isn't like those objects of the mind.
Finally,
oh, right. And also, yes, just because atheists or skeptics or whoever talks about things that exist in a non-material way, that is kind of an equivocation in a sense, because when we're saying exist here, we're not talking, I think we're not talking about objects of the mind, because if God is just an object of the mind, then who cares, right? Like, it only matters if God is really real and not just something we invented and came up with, right? So, yeah, I think you're, I would call it a potential equivocation, because I don't think he's using the word in a different way, but he's kind of doing it sort of. Anyway, sorry.
Atheist Forum asks, how do so many people believe that he exists but can't describe what he's made of? This is a confused complaint. Here's why.
Confused complaint is not a logical fallacy there. I mean, I thought you were talking about what logical fallacies they had. This is it's an irrelevant thing. It's somewhat loaded, somewhat malformed. Uh, it's not a complaint because you're asking a question. Questions, I guess a question could be a complaint, but why is this potato not fully cooked is a question and a complaint simultaneously. But confused complaint, that's not a logical fallacy. Okay, then and below that says you don't need to know what something is made of to know that it exists. Example, gravity. Correct. So that was, so I would have put this as a malformed question. So you cited a fallacy that's not even a fallacy here. I went into more depth than you did. But then again, your video is only 5 minutes long, and mine so far is 25. Believe me.
You don't need to know what something is made of to know that it exists. We know that gravity exists, even if we don't know what it is. So what have we learned? First, Christianity holds that God is not made of anything. Instead, he is an immaterial spirit. Therefore,
yes. Okay. So Christianity holds X, Y, and Z. Great. That's fine. But why are you assuming that this particular atheist is talking about the Christian God? They said God. They didn't say Christian God. So aren't you assuming something too? It's like our God's not that, But yeah, Christianity says a lot of things about God. You know what it doesn't do? Provide any actual evidence for any of this, or a way to test it, or valid and sound argument that I've seen. So, in your video here, I'm going to give you, let's see, two. I mean, okay, the first one you got pretty right. Second one, nope. Third, also no. So, yeah, 1 out of 3. So I'm going to have to say you failed. You tried, though. I mean, it was a good effort of doing something that looks like logic. It's not, but it's it might confuse people that don't know logic. So, and since apologists, don't care if they confuse people or whatever, I suppose that's your gimmick. That's fine.
Asking what is God made of is an incoherent question. It's kind of like saying the number 4 is immaterial and then asking, what's it made of?
Right. And if God is like the number 4, then it only exists in our brain. So does your God only exist in the brain?
Second, if God is by definition immaterial and
your God,
you start by assuming that only material things exist, of course you're going to conclude that there is no God.
Well, you don't need to assume that the only things that are material. But the thing is, the things that are non-material in the only way that I can really properly place that are objects of the mind, and they exist in our head, but not in any other way. And if that's where God exists, great, I agree. That's why I don't believe it's real in the sense that I'm real. It's real in a different way of being real, if you will. It's like we need a different word or something. It's like it's an object of the mind. It's hard to exactly explain and anyway. So good try. Let's see what else he has to say. Anything relevant?
But that's because your starting place disqualifies God from the beginning.
Well, again, if all we look at is the observable universe, we don't have to assume anything at all, right? You just sit down or, stand up or whatever you want to do. You start looking at things. You start poking them, testing them, writing down what you observe, looking at them through a magnifying glass, looking at things with a telescope, and you simply write down observations. You don't have to make any assumptions at all. And you eventually come up with a scientific method to some extent. Not a perfect one by any means, but if all you're doing is using the senses that we have as humans to observe the universe around you. Well, to observe the planet around you and then the universe out there around us. Well, I guess the Earth is part of the universe. Is it? It's not the universe. Anyways, if all you're doing is just observing things and recording them, you're not making any assumptions at all. You don't need to. Because you can go, I don't need to assume naturalism. It's just that if it's not something I can study, then it's not something I can study. So the thing is, when you say, oh yes, there's this thing that's not material, and I say, okay, so there's no way to test it, correct? Of course, that is true. It has to be true. If it's non-material, then there is no empirical evidence. You can't see it. You cannot visualize it at all. Not in any way, shape, or form. So the only thing that you could have, because basically you said science doesn't apply here. Whatever God is, it's not something that science could ever discover, because science only can look at the natural world. And the natural world is all we know about for sure through simple observation. Now, when you go, well, what about the concepts? What about these words? What about these ideas? Those are all in the brain that you can understand that as well. And that's psychology, a different branch of science, right? So you can understand things in that way. So where then do I ever need to think about God if I'm just using observation of the universe? Or there's no when that I need to fill in the blank with that idea, although many people do. Not saying that you're doing God of the Gap, but I'm just saying that, yeah.
Circular reasoning, not careful thinking.
Correct.
This mistake is not surprising. Christian philosopher William Lane Craig
says,
I
don't care what Craig says. So now, see, you've done another, oh man, you were doing so well. Now you're appealing to an authority. It doesn't matter what Craig says. What matters is whether something is true or not. Your argument should be able to stand or fail on its own merits. What does he say? We're so schooled in materials. Yeah. Well, it's not that we're schooled in materialism per se. It's that that's the only thing that you can say we know for sure that exists is the material world. As far as the concepts, yeah, they exist, but they exist within the brain of the material world, within the brain that is itself material. So that's it. And they don't exist in the way that you would need God to exist. So that's a problem.
It's assumptions.
Yeah, blah, blah,
to know that it is real. On here. Third, we don't need to know what something is made of to know that it is real.
That's correct. You don't need to know what something is made of to know whether it's real or not.
Ironically, science works in the opposite direction. First, it discovers that something is real, like gravity, and then it tries to describe what that thing is like. So Atheist Forum provides 3 questions designed to raise doubts about the existence of God.
Well, I don't know what they're designed for. Maybe they're legitimately asking that question. I don't know. But yeah, whoever did that did a bad job of those questions. Yeah. Hey, you could hire me. I'm an amateur logician. I'd like to become a professional logician by getting paid. I'll fix your questions, Atheist Forum. Whoever that is, whatever that is.
To get the answers they want, they rely on incoherent question, strike 1.
Now, wait a minute. You're assuming that they're trying to get to the questions they want or the answers they want. That you shouldn't do that. Yeah.
Circular reasoning, strike 2, and a confused complaint.
Okay, so yes, no, and no. You know, I agree that all 3 are fallacious questions, but I disagree with the fallacies. So, you know, okay. What are you gonna do?
Living in a material world. We aren't just living in a material world.
That's an assertion that you have to prove.
We're living in a material and immaterial world. And
What do you mean by that?
those immaterial things like God are no less real. Class
Well, what do you mean by real in this case?
dismissed.
All right, so that was interesting. He's got some other stuff. I think I might have to subscribe just so I can keep a watch on him and see if anything pops up that's worth an edited video. I thought I'd do this as a live thing, but before I close, because I think that these things are important to really dive into and really try to explain and work out here. Okay. So you're gonna have to forgive me for my drawing skills or lack thereof, I suppose, as I draw my little stick figure here. And I don't know where this dot came from. Okay, so let's make the brush size bigger. Let's give him eyes. There we go. Oh yeah, this is great. No, let's do this. Yeah. No, let's make him jaded. Like, no. Yeah, make him happy. Okay, but also like kind of jaded. Like I don't know. Anyway, so in this guy's brain, which we're gonna put right about here somewhere, which is kind of like pink. It kind of looks like a brain. Whatever. But anyways, in this guy's brain, and in all are things like numbers, letters, words, and musical notes. Let me see if I could. How do I draw a musical note? Oh, bleep! I have to look up how to draw a musical note. Okay, yeah. Okay, I got it. Wait, come on. Let me paint here. Come on, here we go. All right, there we go. Yeah, I did it. and musical notes, right? Okay, so those are all things that he has in his head, right? That's where they exist. So yes, they exist, but they exist only there. They do not exist out here where he exists. Okay, so there's two types, if you will, of existing. This is why we want this term defined. This is objects of the mind, objects of the mind, OOM or OTM, or let's just say OTM, autumn. And then this is, I don't know, things, I don't know, things. Okay, whatever. So if God is here, right? I agree. I absolutely agree. If you think that that's where God is, because that's the only where I can see that God exists is as an object of the mind, not as this sort of thing. This sort of thing is different. So this has to be then a separate category beyond things of the mind, and so it's non-material, it's non-this, it's not this, it's not whatever. So it's something that isn't just an object of the mind and yet still exists. How does that work? Don't tell me what it is not, tell me what it actually is. And you can't do that. I don't think so. And that will be my challenge to Red Pen Logic is give me a logically coherent argument. Forget that. Just you don't even, I'm not even going to sit there and analyze an argument. Just give me how this works in the first place. Don't just assert that it's that way. Demonstrate how it's that way and how you know any of it besides, it's in the Bible. Yeah, we know it's in the Bible. Okay. How do you know that stuff is true? How do you know, how do you know any of these things? And apart from the Bible, how could anyone hope to discover that these things are true? Since if all we did was observe with our senses, we would never see God in the material realm. Isn't that a problem? I don't know. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Lobsters.